All right, today we're going deep. I mean, really deep, right down to the molecular level. We're going to talk about the fundamental components that make all life on Earth, well, possible. We're talking about biomolecules. So let's just kick things off with a massive question. What are we really made of? If you look beyond the skin and bone, what are the actual chemical building blocks that come together to create a living, breathing being like you?
And that leads to this incredible idea. Life itself is built from stuff that isn't alive. Just let that sink in for a second. It's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it? How does a collection of completely inanimate atoms and molecules become a living thing? How does basic chemistry become biology? Well, let's find out.
Turns out, it all comes down to four major classes of biomolecules. You can think of them as the main ingredients in the recipe for life. We've got carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. For this explainer, we're going to zero in on the first three, because their roles are absolutely crucial.
First up, carbohydrates. Now, think of these as both the powerhouses and the scaffolding of the biological world. They're providing the energy and they're building the physical structures.
Their more scientific name is saccharides, which comes from the Greek word for, you guessed it, sugar. And that's a perfect clue, because at their very core, that's what carbohydrates are all about.
The simplest, most basic form is a monosaccharide. That's just a single sugar unit. Let's picture it like a single brick. Glucose, the sugar in honey and sweet fruits, is a perfect example. It's the fundamental fuel that powers our cells.
So what happens when you link a few of those bricks together? Well, then you get an oligosaccharide. And you definitely know the most famous one, sucrose, which is just plain old table sugar. It's really just one glucose brick bonded to one fructose brick. Simple as that.
And what if you go big and link hundreds or even thousands of those bricks into a massive chain? Then you've got a polysaccharide. These are huge molecules like starch and cellulose. And because they're so big, they usually aren't sweet at all, which is why they're often called non-sugars. And this is really where we see their two main jobs come into play.
And this is a perfect illustration of those two big jobs. On one hand, polysaccharides are all about storing food. Think of the starch in a potato. It's basically a giant energy bank packed full of glucose. But on the other hand, they're a structural material. Cellulose, which is made of the exact same glucose units, just linked together differently, forms the tough, rigid cell walls of plants. It's literally the difference between your food and the wood in your furniture.
Okay, so carbohydrates give us the fuel and the structure. But what's actually doing all the work in our cells? That would be our next biomolecule, proteins. You can think of these guys as the tiny, dynamic machines of life.
And really, their name says it all. It comes from the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. And that is no exaggeration. Proteins are involved in practically every single process that happens inside a living organism.
So what are they? Well, proteins are polymers, which is just a long chain made up of smaller building blocks called amino acids. Imagine you have a string and 20 different kinds of beads. The specific sequence you string those beads in is what makes one protein totally different from another. It's the difference between an enzyme that digests your food and the keratin that makes up your hair.
But here's where it gets amazing. That simple chain of beads doesn't just stay a long, floppy string. It starts to fold. It twists into simple shapes like spirals and sheets, and then the entire chain folds up on itself into a complex, unique 3D shape. And that final shape is everything. That shape is what allows the protein to do its specific job. It's how a simple string of chemicals becomes a working machine.
And because that shape is so critical, what happens when it's lost? Well, that's called denaturation. The protein unfolds, gets all tangled up, and it just stops working. The perfect example from your kitchen is boiling an egg. The heat denatures the proteins in the egg white, making them unravel and tangle together, turning from clear and liquid to white and solid. The machine is officially broken.
All right, so we've got fuel from carbohydrates and machines from proteins. But what's the blueprint? What's telling the cell which proteins to build and when to build them? For that, we've got to look at our third and final biomolecule for today, the nucleic acids.
This right here is the information system of life. We're talking about DNA and RNA. These are the molecules that store and transmit all our genetic information. They literally hold the instructions for building an entire organism, and crucially, for passing those instructions from one generation to the next.
Now, there are two main types, DNA and RNA.
And as you can see, they're really similar, but with a few key differences. DNA is that famous double helix, while RNA is usually just a single strand. They also use slightly different chemical letters, or bases. The best way to think about it is this. DNA is the master blueprint, kept super safe in the cell's main office, the nucleus. RNA is like a working photocopy of one page of that blueprint, which gets sent out to the construction site, the rest of the cell, to actually build the proteins.
And the secret to DNA's stable double helix structure is just a simple, elegant rule. The chemical bases always pair up in a specific way. A always pairs with T, and C always pairs with G. That's it. This reliable pairing is the absolute foundation of how genetic information is stored and copied so perfectly.
So, when you put it all together, what do you have? You've got carbohydrates for energy, proteins acting as the machines, and nucleic acids holding the blueprint. Together, these things create what's been called the molecular logic of life. It's an unbelievably intricate and beautiful system, all built from these basic parts.
And that leaves us with a final, fascinating thought to chew on. Every single living thing we know of, from a tiny bacterium to a massive blue whale, uses this exact same molecular toolkit. The same types of sugars for energy, the same 20 amino acids to build proteins, the same genetic code. So what does this profound unity at the molecular level suggest about the origin of all life on Earth? It's a powerful question, and it all starts with the chemistry we've explored today. Thanks for joining me on this.